What's good, YouTube? I'm here with the most spherical dude, DZ.
Hey guys, how's it going?
And we have a pretty interesting discussion for you guys today. It's actually that Link, the mechanic of Links, have sped up the game despite restricting the board. I think through Links, I've seen more extra deck usage than ever before, but besides maybe the Syncro turbo decks.
Right, so when links were first announced, a lot of people, including myself actually in a couple live streams, noticed that the link monsters in general seemed like a restrictive mechanic where they prevented you from using your old mechanics. However, as we've seen very recently, a lot of the times they're actually just letting you summon even more monsters than you were able to, mostly because they're the least restrictive. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through pretty much all of the extra deck mechanics in order of how they appeared in history and talk about what made each of them good and bad, and then also talk about why link summoning may be the most broken one, even though right now it might not seem like that.
So first we go all the way back. We're going to LOB with the fusions. And the main thing about fusions, I feel, is that you need some kind of spell card or enabling card in order to bring a fusion out of the extra deck. And that holds true with a few exceptions to most of them today.
Even back then, not only did you need the spell card, you also needed specific monsters, 2 specific monsters at least, and there weren't a lot of searchers back in the day, so it was just really inefficient. Even in modern fusion monsters, the best ones are the ones that require like the least restrictive fusion materials. So if you think of like Shadalls or Metal Foes, the reason that those were so popular is because they don't take like a specific, you don't need Shadal Squamata to make Construct, you just need any Shadal monster, and their fusion spells give you some sort of compensation for the minus and card advantage. But these old fusion monsters, I mean, they took 2 specific cards and a specific spell in a time when there just wasn't a lot of searching, just incredibly inefficient. And it's why we really didn't see any fusion monsters back in the old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Besides like things that you could summon a Metamorphosis, which really isn't the same thing as like a normal fusion summon.
And even with like Shadol fusion, you still need specifically Shadol monsters, and then to get the free effect, you need your opponent to have an extra deck monster. So you need all these things to set up where it's still all these specifics. And we go forward, and ironically, this is near the Syncro era, or I think even in when Gyzaris is released, and it's contact fusing, but it's still very specific. You need 2 Gladiator Beast monsters, and 2 very specific ones. You need Bestiary and then any, but you kind of have this archetype specific fusion mechanic that allowed you to tag in and out, which kind of is close to link summoning, but much more specific.
Yeah, and you can kind of see that Konami almost was sort of testing the waters with these contact fusions. The original Neos contact fusions actually had some pretty decent effects without the drawback that they tacked on there, where they return back to the extra deck in the end phase. And I almost want to say that the reason Konami did that, I'm sure there's probably some anime reason, but from a gameplay standpoint, they were maybe wondering if it was too overpowered to have a monster that could be summoned from the extra deck without using a spell card. They realized that those cards were trash because of that drawback. So when they gave us Gyzaris, it doesn't have that drawback, which made Gladiator Beast one of the best decks of all time, especially during the time period that they were being played. But like John said, these really were close to the link summon. As far as like all of the other things we're going to talk about here, for all intents and purposes, like contact fusions, specifically the Glad Beast ones, are quite similar to link summoning, except for the fact that the contact fusions, like all fusion monsters, tend to have the most restrictive material requirements. Gyzaris specifically takes Bestiary and then a Glad Beast monster, which makes it not nearly as generic. All contact fusions that I've known are not meant to be put into any deck. They're meant to be put into their archetypes deck, which is obviously very different than pretty much all of the future extra deck mechanics that we're going to talk about here.
All right, now we go into the 5Ds era, and pretty much one of the most impactful upon release extra deck mechanics besides link monsters now. The Synchros really had their time, but there's one huge clog, and that's that every Synchro requires a tuner.
Yeah, I mean, back then, if you haven't played in that format when Synchros first came out, just remember that it was actually a pretty big deal when Rose Warrior of Revenge, which is just basically a vanilla level 4 tuner monster. When that card was announced, people freaked out because it was the first like level 4 tuner monster. And if that tells you something about the competitive landscape at the time, or even the fact that Krebens was played, You can see that the tuner monsters themselves back then, especially at the very beginning, didn't really do anything besides make synchros, which is sort of I mean, the only reason that Dark and Dragon Teleport was so good was because of Emergency Teleport, not so much of the Krebins, which was kind of interesting because if you look at nowadays, all the tuners that you're playing your decks, they have to do like maybe not even just one thing. They have to do like multiple things. If you think of like the things that people are still playing nowadays, GoFu or Glow Up Bulb, cards like those, they actually just do so many different things. Where a situation, if you release synchros nowadays, cards like Krebins just wouldn't make the cut. They're too bland. All it does is block attack points. Not to mention you had to not only have a tuner and a non-tuner, you had to have them meet to that specific level, which is just like an insane amount of things have to go right for you to synchro summon. And it only really worked because it was the first extra deck mechanic outside of fusion summoning. So it didn't have any other competition, which made it a lot better. And in comparison to fusion summon, synchros are quite better, or quite a lot better than they are.
The monsters are just insane. Black Rose, for example, even today when it gets summoned, it's like, what, Nani? What's happening here? It's just blowing everything up. Like, Exiton's kind of on that level too, but for different reasons, it was very good. But Black Rose and Stardust, upon release, were just insane introductions into the game. And the most similar thing here to the mechanic is, the monsters do have to be face up, pretty much similarly for every extra deck mechanic, except for fusion, surprisingly. You're allowed to fuse with the face down monsters when you're using the spell, but with your extra deck monsters for the next mechanics, they pretty much have to be face up in order to get them. So first you have to have them face up, and then you also send them to the graveyard, similar to Link's. But the huge difference is that you have to have a specific type of monster created in the game just to enable the extra deck here.
And with them, one of the things about synchros, they're like by far, and I've said this in a couple of my videos, level 8 synchros specifically, and also Black Rose, are some of the most timeless extra deck monsters of all time. I mean, Stardust was the debut synchro monster in Duelist Genesis, and it's still being played as recently as the 2017 National Championship. You do not see, I mean, so technically you see Utopia being played, but it's only for Lightning. You don't see Gachi Gachi Gentetsu still being played, and yet even to this day, and I would probably say for the foreseeable future, we still see Stardust Dragon, Black Rose Dragon, all those old cards. They're just timeless. They're so powerful.
And speaking of Xyz, that would be our next era that we're stepping into. The introduction of overlaying. This is less restrictive in some senses than tuners, but you needed monsters of the same level. You needed to have 2 level 4s, specifically 2 level 5s. This mechanic is still based around levels, which is what restricts it from just being all hell breaking loose on the game. You weren't able to use just any kind of monster. You had to have, say, a resource such as Tour Guide to bring out another 3, or Rescue Rabbit to bring out 2 of these 4s, and usually they're not making Utopia at this point. They're making Dolka, Lagia, really insane monsters.
And with those, I mean, once again, if you weren't playing the game back when Synchros and Exceeds were around originally, one of the big reasons that Exceeds were really important was because there were a ton of decks back then that could not play Synchros effectively. There just were so many of them. Pretty much back then, if your deck had like a lot of level 4 monsters, a lot of times you weren't playing Krebins. If you were playing anything, it would be Gale, the Blackwing card, just because it like had a decent on-field effect. So there was a lot of pushback because only certain decks could really take advantage of synchro summons, because not every deck could afford to summon the tuners next to the non-tuners. So when you put Exceed monsters into the game, they're a lot more generic, like John was saying, where you just need any 2 level 4 monsters or any 2 level 3 monsters. And that was huge, because that was really, I mean, you see fusion monsters getting the pushback of you need specific cards. So like, okay, we'll let you use synchro monsters. But then people are saying, well, I don't want to play tuners. Like, okay, fine, you can have Exceed monsters. And it definitely, that sort of design change there, you can see carry over to Link monsters.
Yeah, and we go further. We go beyond the probably most hated mechanic into pendulums here. Pendulums are really good at resourcing themselves. They don't necessarily always special from the extra, but what was huge about them is when they're destroyed, they go face up into the extra and then can be summoned back out using scales. The problem, though, was a lot of the initial releases had restrictions. Both of these actually have restrictive clauses on what you can pendulum summon should you use them as a scale ever, and a lot of the scales would have effects like this will only be a certain level if you have another. Despite that, it's one of the best for summoning monsters out of the hand, and it did speed up the game a lot to a point where they had to consider, wow, we actually need to hit one of the deck's fastest, which was full power pendulums. But outside of that, they really didn't have a lot of time to shine until now with the modern pendulum magicians under the link mechanic.
It's pretty funny because we were talking about it earlier. Pendulums are sort of unique because they're really, I mean, they are an extra deck mechanic, but they start in the main deck. So of all of these, they're sort of the least impactful for that reason. Same problem, or the same reason that the extra deck is so powerful is also the same reason that pendulums for a lot of their time were just too inconsistent. Just basic card theory is that if you have to draw a card, it's going to be less powerful, and if you can just summon it from the extra deck at any time. Now, I will say pendulums were powerful. I mean, full power Pepe is one of the most ridiculous decks ever. But outside of that, and outside of Cliffforts and maybe Metal Foes, the pendulum decks just weren't ever good, but they weren't necessarily. I mean, when Synchros came out, man, Teleport Dark Arm Dragon, that was like unbeatable basically. But you look at pendulums, and when they first came out, not a lot of people even played them until Cliffforts came out, mainly because you had to put them in the scales, which is, for, I mean, in a lot of ways that's a -2 because it takes 2 cards out of your hand just to set up the pendulum scale. So until we got cards like Scout and Joker and all the performance pals that search themselves, it just wasn't good card economy to play. But also,
even then, you were kind of just pendulum summoning from your hand for Cleese to summon towers. Your point wasn't to special from the extra deck necessarily.
Right, and then also what you were saying before this too was that with the pendulums, they're not actually getting you any different cards out of the extra deck. They're just getting themselves, where at least like tuners or like 2 level 4 monsters get like a powerful synchro out of the extra deck. Pendulums, they just brought themselves back, which in a vacuum isn't as powerful as synchros or exceeds, because they were limited to how powerful the cards themselves were, not what they could get.
Yeah, it's more for a longer game. You're a resource game. You're putting things in the extra to bring them back. It's not necessarily for a faster game. And that brings us full circle to where we are today with the link mechanic, with these monsters that are just made to use any kind of monster listed on it just to bring it out. You just have to have your 2 face-up cards or more, depending on what you have, and use them as the materials, and you get a 6th monster slot on the field in order to flood the field.
Yes, I mean, I think people's big like apprehensions with link monsters, at least my own, was like the arrow mechanic. But if you sort of, and it is kind of hard to take it out of the equation, but when you're only summoning link monsters, you sort of do get to take it out of the equation because they all just have so many arrows pointing to each other. And when you take that out of the equation, I mean, these cards are pretty insane. We're already seeing cards like Mrs. Radiant and Mr. Boy being played despite not really having very impactful effects, but they're just so darn easy to summon. It really is. And a lot of times, I mean, if you think of why cards like Diamond Direwolf or Lavalval Chain were so great, one of the reasons was because they could immediately detach the materials on them on your first turn against a clear board. Because a lot of times you actually want the cards you're using as materials in the graveyard. And one of my favorite things about link monsters, even though I'm not super happy with the entire mechanic, but one of my favorite things is that when you summon them, you're immediately sending those cards to the graveyard, much like Synchros, except you don't need a tuner and a non-tuner. You just need like 2 earth monsters or 2 effect monsters. It's by far the most generic way to summon these things, and it puts the guys right in the grave immediately.
And I think one of the really huge things is how you can use any link monster as its counters as multiple. So like this Proxy Dragon counts as 2 materials for this Decode Talker, and then it even bypasses. You can use any monsters for Proxy Dragon, and now you have an effect monster as well to go into Decode Talker. Not only that, but take up 2. So there's just ways to go through your extra deck faster than ever. Like even with Zoo breaking the mechanic, I would argue that with things like Firewall Dragons and the loops, I've seen people go through more cards in their extra deck in a single turn besides any deck that's not a full power synchro deck.
I mean, I think that's pretty accurate, especially now that we're talking about spirals in the OCG. They're just dominating everyone. They can just summon so many cards compared to what any other deck was. And we're pretty early in the link summoning. I mean, I guess OCG's had it longer than we have. But if you look back to like pendulums and stuff like that, and pendulums, synchros, and exceeds, we really didn't get these powerful of decks that soon. Where spirals are pretty much, I mean, we're going to be in our second set of links, and we're already basically have a tier 0 deck, as much as I hate to use that word, which is pretty insane.
Yeah, 75% of the OCG top cut this last week. It's pretty insane. And I just want to say that these kinds of mechanics, these abilities to go through your plays, to go through your deck, to go through everything, is all enabled by this insanely non-specific mechanic. Now, you can turn them to be specific, but at the same time, you have cards like Firewall that just any 4 monsters are fine, any link markers are fine, anything is fine to make this card, and that's what really speeds it up despite its restrictions. And then it has an effect that also lets you resource your deck back. Very similar to Pendulums, you're able to maintain your advantage over and over and over while building your board.
Absolutely. And we don't know exactly what the link monsters in the new legacy set are going to be, but I would assume that they're all going to be at least halfway decent, which really could bring a lot more of those older decks into popularity again. If you give, because we have like Lightsworns, Cliffort, Burning Abyss, and Glads announced as like the cards that are getting link monsters right now, and they can make a huge difference if they go along with that archetype, because link monsters is a way to sort of balance them is by making them specific. So if they make them to specific to those decks, you can then give them much more powerful effects within that own archetype, which then hopefully will make those older decks a lot more powerful.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like they need to take a step back. Look at that, they've already had to hit cards around Firewall in the first ban list within the link mechanic being introduced, the link era, and really see that, wow, we've created things for the first time in the game since the Monarch decks where we immediately took care of the FTKs. We also have FTKs now, and that's usually a sign of an unhealthy game. It's usually a sign of a game that is moving too fast. When turn 1, it's over.
No, I think that pretty much sums everything up.
Yeah, I definitely think that it just breaks the mechanic, it breaks what it's doing, and I think you're right. It needs to go more specific, very much like the old mechanics, but I also do like that the generic support will enable older decks, but I want more generic support for those older decks as well.
Absolutely.
Any shout-outs here at the end?
To my own channel, check it out if you enjoyed this discussion. I do lots of discussions on there.
All right, do visit DZ, great guy, really awesome discussions. I pretty much tune in every day myself. You got a lovely banner over there.
On your vacation.
All right, man, take it easy.